Hello, children of God. Welcome to your review video for Unit 4.1, the Exodus Study Guide. This video will take you through everything you need to know for the study guide and everything you need to know for your test. So strap on your seatbelts and get ready to study. Some other things I recommend for reviewing for this test are looking over some of your old homeworks, reviewing the answers to the questions, because a lot of those stories will be on the test, and so it'll just help you to refamiliarize yourself with those. So go back through the homeworks, especially the Passover homework. If you didn't get a chance to watch that video on the Passover, that's also on this page in the same playlist. So make sure you watch the Passover video, because that's stuff we didn't hit super hard in class. That was just stuff you're expected to do for homework. So make sure you watch that as well. So let's get started. So we talked about what are the different groups that make up the Israelites as they move out of Egypt and they migrate into the Promised Land. Eventually, they're going to pick up some other groups that include the former Hebrews, but other groups that lived in Canaan, the Canaanites, these other tribes. You don't need to have all those memorized, but just know that it was a group of other people that lived in Canaan. It would not have been Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Assyrians, those larger empires that later conquered them. It would not include those groups. Here's some vocab for you. Number 2, define the following. Idolatry, which would be the worshiping of idols, which would be the worshiping of a person or a thing. So like the Egyptians worshipped their pharaoh as a god, so that would be idolatry. Or like we read the story of the golden calf where they worship that golden statue. That would be idolatry. Manna is the bread that God gives them in the desert, the bread from heaven that God just makes appear on the ground like frost, and that's how they survive through the 40 years in the desert. A Levite is someone from the tribe of Levi, and they are the tribe of priests. And then the Ark of the Covenant, that is the gold box that they build, and they put the 10 Commandments and Moses' staff in it, and they carry it around with them wherever they go, and it's a sign of God's presence with them. Moving on, what is Passover and what is the Seder meal? Again, this was part of that homework where you watched the video lecture on the Passover. It's the biggest Jewish holiday. A lot of Americans think Hanukkah is the biggest Jewish holiday, but we just think that because it's near Christmas. But really, Passover is the biggest Jewish holiday. It's a huge deal, 8-day feast. It starts off with the Seder meal, and it is commemorating God liberating them from Egypt. So it begins the Passover, and they have bread, wine, lamb, a few other things. How did the Hebrews become enslaved in Egypt? It's because they become very numerous, and there's a new Pharaoh. This is hundreds of years later after Joseph's dead, and all his descendants have grown very numerous, and so the new Pharaoh doesn't know anything about Joseph and enslaves the Hebrews because they become too numerous. Moses is not raised by his mother because Pharaoh is trying to get rid of a lot of the Hebrews and lower their numbers, so he puts out an order to kill all the Hebrew infant boys. So Moses' mom, to save him, puts him on a basket in the river. He's found by Pharaoh's daughter, who finds him and raises him, and then sends for a Hebrew woman to be his nurse, and that ends up being his mom. So he ends up being nursed by his own mom, but then raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He eventually flees from Egypt. This is number 6, because he sees an Egyptian striking a Hebrew slave, and he gets angry and kills the Egyptian slave, and the matter becomes known, and so he has to flee because the Pharaoh is out to arrest him because he killed an Egyptian. God first speaks to Moses in the desert in a burning bush. Moving on, number 8, the 3 words used for God in the Old Testament, what does each mean? This is all in notes 2. So the main one is Yahweh, which is God's name. When Moses asks, what God are you? What is your name? He says, I am who am, meaning I'm not the God of fire, I'm not the God of the mountain, I'm not this God or that God or any other gods you might have heard of in Egypt. I just am. I am the God. I am the foundation of all existence. And so his name is Yahweh. Now, the word in Hebrew for just God, so like the river God or the mountain God or whatever God, is Elohim. So when they're just talking about whatever God, like the river Elohim is the river God. So when they're just using the word God, they use Elohim. When they're using God's name, they use Yahweh. But because the Hebrew is one of their commandments is to not take the Lord God, the God's name in vain, they don't ever say Yahweh except in very rare circumstances. They consider it as they're unworthy to say the name. So instead of saying Yahweh, they say Adonai or Lord. This is why oftentimes in the Bible when you come across the word Lord, it's in all caps. If you read it in the original Hebrew, it would say Yahweh there, but when they say it, they say Adonai. They say Lord because they don't want to speak God's name. when they're not worthy of it, is how they see it. Number 9, what objections does Moses make to God's call, and what is God's response to each? We went over this in notes number 3, the reading guide, where we read through all those stories. And Moses objects 3 things. He says, what if they won't believe? And God gives him 3 signs that he can do. He can turn his staff into a snake, he can make his hand leprous, and he can also pour a bucket of the Nile River out and it'll turn into blood. Second objection, it says he's a bad speaker. God says, I'll assist you. Moses says, please send someone else. And he says he'll send his brother Aaron to help. So those are the 3 things that he says. Number 10, what is Pharaoh's response when Moses first requests that he let the Hebrews go out into the desert to pray? He makes the Hebrews do more work. They have to gather their own straw for their bricks rather than just making the bricks. But he says they have to keep making the same number of bricks per day, their same quota, even though they have more work now. Why do the Hebrews complain in the desert? They complain for all sorts of reasons. They complain because they have no food, because they have no water, because they're scared of the Egyptians, because they have food but it's not meat. They complain that the journey is hard. They complain about all sorts of things. In what form does God appear to the people on Mount Sinai? On the 3rd day, he appears as a cloud of fire in smoke. How is the covenant at Sinai different from God's covenant with Abraham? The Sinai covenant includes the law. Abraham only had to worship the Lord and be circumcised, whereas now after this covenant with all the people of Israel and Moses, they have to follow the rules of the law. How does Moses seal the covenant? He takes a bull and sacrifices it and takes the blood of the bull and sprinkles it on the people. What did it mean to be ritually unclean? There's a lot of laws in the law of Moses about what makes you clean and what makes you unclean, and a lot of times modern people misinterpret this because we read it and we think it's saying, oh, it's good or it's bad, and that's not really what it means. If you were ritually unclean, it meant you couldn't offer sacrifice, and that wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it meant that you had done something really sacred or something really important. So, like, for example, a woman was unclean after she'd given birth, not because birth was a bad thing, but they just kind of marked that as a significant thing, saying, oh, you should take a break from sacrificing for a few days. There's normally some process to become clean again, but it wasn't always seen as like a good or an evil thing. It's kind of a little weird for us to understand. It's a strange cultural difference from our own. Number 16, why do Hebrews make the golden calf and what's it supposed to be? So when Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God and get the 10 Commandments, he's there for 40 days, and so they think Moses has abandoned him, and they make a new god, which is this golden calf, which is supposed to be their new god, and it actually resembles the Canaanite god Baal, B-A-A-L, who was portrayed as a golden cow or bull. Number 17, what does Moses do when he sees the people worshiping the golden calf? He smashes the tablets with the 10 Commandments, symbolizing that they had shattered their covenant with God or broken their covenant with God, the commands of the law. So he breaks the commandments to symbolize that they had broken the commandments. And then he grinds up the golden calf and pours it into water and makes them all drink it. 18, what strange thing happens to Moses after he's been talking with God? His face shines so brightly that he has to wear a veil so it doesn't hurt people's eyes. What does God warn the people about before they enter the promised land? He warns them about the dangers of prosperity and that they're going to forget about God's blessing. That having too much, they're going to forget that they need God and they can't just rely on themselves and their own riches. Who will lead the people into the promised land? Joshua will, because Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land because he didn't trust God when he hit the stick with the rock to get water. He hit it a second time, and so that's seen as a sign of Moses is failing. So he does get to see the promised land, but he doesn't get to enter into it. Number 21, what are the 10 Commandments? Are you really going to make me memorize the 10 Commandments for this test, Mr. Tenney? I don't know. Am I? Be worth memorizing the 10 Commandments. That's something you should know. As a student in a Catholic school, you should know the 10 Commandments. So here's how you break them down. This is how I remember it, is there's 3 that have to do with God. There's the middle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have to do with neighbor. And then the last 2 are the covets, the ones that have to do with coveting. So worship only one God is the first one. Don't take the Lord's name in vain is the second one. Keep holy the Sabbath day is the third one. Then honor your parents, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and don't bear false witness, which is don't lie. And the last two, don't covet thy neighbor's things, don't covet thy neighbor's wife. So if you can kind of break them into those chunks, and remember you have 3, then you have 5, then you have 2, makes it a little easier to remember if you can remember those categories. All right, and then number 22 and number 3, these will be your essays, maybe. Who knows? How does Jesus reinterpret the Seder meal during Passover to have new meaning for Christians? What significance does the Passover have for modern Christians? This, again, would be a good time to watch that previous video that I did on Passover. So if you didn't do that homework or you're a little rusty on that homework, go back and watch that video again. It's in the same playlist. So at the Last Supper, Jesus takes the things of the Passover and reinterprets them to be about himself. So at the Last Supper, they had unleavened bread. He takes this bread and he says, this is now my body. Okay. They also had lamb at the Last Supper. I'm sorry, at the Passover, and the Last Supper is a Passover meal. So they don't have lamb actually. Jesus says, I am the lamb. And just like at the Passover, they took the blood of the lamb and wiped it on the door, and that saved them from death. Jesus is saying, I'm going to be sacrificed because I'm the Lamb of God, and my blood will save you from death. So that's why he calls his bread, his body, and he calls himself the Lamb because he's going to be sacrificed. And then the wine, he says, this is the blood of the new covenant, just like Moses sprinkled the blood of the bull on the people to signify the first covenant. Jesus is going to say, my blood, this wine is my blood, and it's the blood of the new covenant. You're now consuming this and being initiated into a new covenant with God that is for all people. Some other things from the Last Supper passage. In the Passover, there are 4 cups of wine drank throughout, and Jesus has 2 cups that he talks about during the Last Supper, but then he has a 3rd cup that he talks about when he's in the garden, when he's accepting his Father's will, and he says, Father, I hope that this cup can pass me by, meaning that he doesn't have to go through the passion, but he says, but thy will be done, not my will be done, and I will drink this cup of poison if you want me to. And then when he's on the cross, he says that he's thirsty, but then when they actually offer him something to drink, he says, no, it is finished. And what that means is that his sacrifice on the cross is the 4th cup because he is the Passover lamb. That's a little more complicated. If you don't understand the 4 cups thing, don't worry about it. That would be like extra bonus. This next part for modern Christians is not extra bonus. You need to include this. For modern Christians, we celebrate the Last Supper on Holy Thursday, but also every time we celebrate the Eucharist. The Eucharist is like the Passover 2.0. We do that in remembrance of Jesus. So that's the significance for modern Christians. All right, and explain how the law of Moses was important to the Hebrews on both a cultural and a religious moral level. Which aspects of the law do Christians follow and why? So the law was really important to them because that's how they upheld their part of the covenant. God took care of them. They followed the laws of the covenant, and that's how they were faithful to the covenant. That was their part of the deal. And there were two types of laws. There were cultural laws, how they dressed, what they ate, being circumcised, feast days, those sorts of things. Those helped them just kind of maintain a cultural identity when they got conquered by the Babylonians or Egyptians or whoever was ruling them. It helped them to stay Hebrew even though when they didn't have like a Hebrew country or an Israel as a country, they could still be Israel as a people because they clung to these cultural laws, okay? It helped them maintain holiness apart from other nations. Now, they also had laws that were more like the laws that you and I would expect, the more religious laws. Don't kill, don't steal, take care of the poor, those sorts of things. These teach them how to live in God's image, to do good and to not sin. And these are the ones that Christians still follow. Why do Christians still follow these? They follow these because Christians don't need to maintain that cultural separation from other nations anymore, okay? Part of the Israelite Hebrew identity was that they were God's people and other groups were not. They were the chosen people of God that would eventually bless all nations as part of the covenant with Abraham. That's what God promised, that eventually this nation that came from Abraham would bless all nations. Well, in Jesus, that happened. Jesus said, this is for all people. I have come that all might have life. I'm offering this for the sins of the world, okay? And so now it's not just for this one nation anymore. It's now for everyone. And so that's the fulfillment of Abraham's promise. The promise that God made to Abraham is that this nation now, through Jesus, has blessed the whole world. So that's why Christians don't follow those those cultural laws about eating kosher and being circumcised and, the Sabbath day on Saturday and what to eat and what to drink. But they do follow the moral laws because those are about living in God's image, and those transcend culture. Those go beyond culture. So those are the essays. Good luck on your test.